According to the Wikipedia page entitled Association Football Positions, there are 12 primary positions on a football pitch, which are listed as being goalkeeper, centre-back, sweeper, full-back, wing-back, central midfielder, defence midfielder, attacking midfielder, wide midfielder, centre-forward, striker and winger. And we often compare players based upon these classifications. Just last week, my friends and I whittled away at least half an hour of a train journey discussing who is the best goalkeeper and who is the best fullback in the Premier League. I suspect that almost all of you have done likewise. If not necessarily on a train then, either in a pub, over a meal, on a group chat, or with strangers on the internet. That last one always works out well. We all do it. At the end of the day, what even is a World 11 or Team of the Season, if not a comparison and ranking of the best players in each position? However, in today's video, I put it to you that comparing players based upon their nominal positions on a pitch makes very little sense, and that perhaps there might be a better way of doing things. Before I begin though, it is probably worth acknowledging the fact that I have made at least 30 videos comparing and ranking players based upon their positions. I made an entire series once ranking the 7 best players in each position at the time of recording. I did another ranking the 7 greatest players of all time in each position, which culminated in my HITC Sevens all-time greatest 11, and most recently, around 2 years ago, I made a series ranking the 7 greatest players of the decade, you guessed it, in each position. Okay, so I think we have established that I'm probably the worst person in the entire world to be making this video, and that I'm about as hypocritical as Jose Mourinho telling other managers not to criticise referees, or the CEO of ExxonMobil telling people that they should watch their carbon footprint by making sure they've switched the standby button off on their TVs. But, crucially, I am at least aware of my own crushing hypocrisy, I make zero effort to deny it, and I have never claimed to be anything other than someone who is plagued by inconsistencies, beset by contradictions, and lives a life of total moral ambiguity. Hopefully that was a sufficiently self-deprecating introduction to today's video, and there is, of course, no longer any need for you to point out what a wretched fraud I am in the comments. One of the most fervent debates in English football in recent years has surrounded the national team's plethora of talented right-backs. Following an era in which John Flanagan and Carl Jenkinson somehow managed to win England caps, now you have a situation where the likes of Tariq Lamptey and James Justin can't even get a look in, with Kyle Walker, Reece James, Kieran Trippier, and Trent Alexander-Arnold, among others, all ahead of them in the England pecking order. People often make incredibly confident claims and assessments of their talents and compare them as if they were like-for-like players, simply because they can or have all played as right-backs. Of course, even the most fleeting of football fans knows that they are all very different players. When comparisons between Aaron Wan-Bissaka and Trent Alexander-Arnold were still a thing, even my 2-year-old nephew could reel off the cliche that Trent is better going forward, but Wan-Bissaka is better defensively, despite the fact that he can't yet spell his own name. By the time he turns 3 and begins to dabble with hyperbole, I've little doubt that he will graduate to claiming that Trent is the best crosser of a ball in world football and Wan-Bissaka is the best 1 versus 1 defender out there. At which point, he will obviously be offered a job as a pundit by either Sky Sports or BT Sport. In reality, the differences between Trent Alexander-Arnold and Aaron Wan-Bissaka are far larger than that, and whilst they might nominally share a position, gender, and nationality, as well as both having double-barreled surnames, the similarities pretty much end there. Trent Alexander-Arnold is, above all else, a playmaker, and playmaker is a far better way in which to describe him than right-back likely ever will be. Of course, we need positional titles, however simplistic, in order to understand a player's very general starting position, but in many instances, that is really all that they tell you. It would make more sense, in reality, to compare Trent Alexander-Arnold with the likes of Bruno Alves, James Ward-Prowse, and Kevin De Bruyne than it does to compare him to Aaron Wan-Bissaka or even Kyle Walker. When people critique Alexander-Arnold, they tend to critique aspects of his game that are either secondary or tertiary responsibilities of his, or, in some instances, they aren't even part of his game at all. Kevin De Bruyne is rubbish defensively. He has excellent stamina when he's fully fit, and he is reasonably quick, strong, and athletic for such a phenomenally creative force built in his mould, which allows him to get up and down the pitch. But honestly, he cannot defend. Whenever Pep Guardiola experimented with a 4-2-3-1, dropping De Bruyne into that sort of deep-lying playmaker role alongside either Rodri or Fernandinho, Manchester City shipped a hatful of goals. And that is no coincidence. This is not a critique of Kevin De Bruyne, just to be clear, who I would say is either the best or second best player in the Premier League alongside Mohamed Salah. It is just that all players have their strengths and weaknesses. Debates about Trent Alexander-Arnold's defensive credentials tend to be a tedious waste of time, but what is often overlooked, whether you think that he has a decent sixth sense for sniffing out danger or not, whether you think that he is hopeless positionally or not, and whether you think that he can't tackle to save his life or is vastly underrated in that department, more often than not, it simply doesn't matter. In the same way that Kevin De Bruyne's defensive frailties don't matter now that Pep Guardiola no longer plays him in that deeper role and always provides him with protection, neither does Alexander-Arnold's both perceived and very real flaws. He is Liverpool's primary creative outlet and primary attacking outlet outside of their front three. Compare that to Aaron Wan-Bissaka's function at Manchester United, and you rapidly begin to realise why comparing the two is entirely illogical. I think Trent Alexander-Arnold is a fairly extreme example of this because he is a very unorthodox fullback. Perhaps the most unorthodox of all time, in fact, but this is true of every English right-back and indeed every footballer, just to a lesser extent. What is perhaps a little unusual is that we acknowledge this fact when it comes to centre-forwards. Few people are still getting bogged down in discussions over whether Roberto Firmino scores enough goals to start for Liverpool now in his 7th season at Anfield, because, broadly speaking, they understand that isn't his job. Or at least, that isn't his only job, or even his main job. Almost everyone appreciates that Harry Kane plays a very different way and performs a very different role now, and indeed any time since 2019, to the one that he played prior to 2019, before his ankles turned to popcorn, yet both positions, where Kane played before and after 2019, are still nominally described as centre-forward. By the same token, Roberto Firmino and Jamie Vardy, you can argue, play in the same position, but their roles in those positions are as different as Mohamed Salah and N'Golo Kante's, Kai Havertz and Jordan Henderson's, or indeed Aaron Wan-Bissaka and Trent Alexander-Arnold's. I don't think that anyone's omission from the England squad and starting 11 causes as much often tedious and tiresome debate as Alexander-Arnold's. The fact that he has only won 16 caps for England, almost none of which have come at tournaments, as he rapidly closes in on 200 appearances for Liverpool, with whom he has already recorded 50 assists, is, to some people, a scandal, and even a sackable offence on the part of Gareth Southgate. I have lost count of the number of times that I've heard people say Trent is the best right-back in the world, yet he can't get a game for England. It may well be true that Trent Alexander-Arnold is the best footballer who plays in a position that we are calling right-back, but the right-back position for Liverpool and the right-back position for England are very different things. You could argue that Alexander-Arnold is so good that Gareth Southgate simply has to play him, and that he has to play him in a similar role to the one that Jurgen Klopp plays him in order to maximise his talents and effectiveness. I don't necessarily agree with that assessment, but I think it is a coherent argument. Playing Alexander-Arnold in that way would almost certainly mean dropping someone like Phil Foden or Jack Grealish, which is why I don't think that Gareth Southgate will do it. But at least if we come at it from the angle of, this is the role that Alexander-Arnold performs, this is what would be needed in order to accommodate him, and here is who would likely miss out, we can start to make a serious comparison. And again, the comparison here is between Alexander-Arnold and someone like Jack Grealish, Phil Foden or Emile Smith-Rowe, rather than with any other right-back, as well as being a comparison between playing two different systems. Apologies to any non-English viewers for getting quite so bogged down in an England-centric example, but understand that This is just one example that I am particularly familiar with the rhetoric around, and that I felt was particularly apt to convey the point that I'm trying to make. You could make exactly the same point in terms of trying to compare compatriots Thomas Muller and Marco Reus for Germany, both of whom are nominally attacking midfielders but perform radically different roles. Or Italy's two first-choice centre-forwards, Andrea Belotti and Ciro Immobile. In truth, comparisons in football can often be very difficult to make and ultimately fairly pointless, but they are fun to argue about, so we shouldn't expect people to stop having them anytime soon. And I'm sure that I'll be back making a video which contains at least some form of comparison before you can say subscribe to HITC Sevens despite him being a massive hypocrite. But if we're going to compare players, we should at least try and compare those where there is some comparison to be had. Duties, roles, and a player's primary function on a football pitch all tend to be better indicators of similar players than where they play. And once you acknowledge that, every time you hear people comparing two radically different footballers who just happen to play in the same or similar positions, you'll really start to notice the silliness of it. That is it for today's video, which is an extremely short one by my standards these days, which I would imagine many of you will be pleased about. Thank you all as ever for watching, and join me tomorrow for a video taking a look at the 7 best central midfielders in world football. Just kidding. Hit the like button if you enjoyed today's video, let me know your thoughts down below in the comments, and make sure, of course, that you are subscribed to, and I'm going to make a comparison here, by far the best YouTube channel in the world, and that is, of course, HITC Sevens. You can also find me on Twitter and on Instagram via the username @HITC Sevens on both, should you wish to do so.